In the early 1990s, Teresa Fusco was a vibrant 21-year-old woman from New Jersey. She was known for her love of life, and her family and friends remembered her as bright, friendly, and full of potential. Teresa was in a long-term but troubled relationship with Frank, a man several years older than her. Friends and family noted that their relationship was tumultuous, filled with arguments and controlling behavior from Frank. Despite the warning signs, Teresa and Frank moved in together. Though Teresa had confided in a few people about feeling trapped in the relationship, she had also expressed hope that things would improve. Unfortunately, Frank was far from the man she hoped he would become. He was jealous and possessive, showing signs of emotional and at times physical abuse. Nevertheless, Teresa remained in the relationship, possibly out of fear or love, though it was clear she was starting to contemplate leaving him. On the night of March 3, 1991, Teresa was last seen leaving her job at a local fast food restaurant. She had mentioned to her friend that she planned to have a quiet evening at home with Frank. However, when Teresa failed to show up for work the following day and did not answer her phone, her family grew concerned. They immediately reported her missing to the police. January 2, 1991. Teresa's family told authorities about the troubled relationship she had with Frank. This led the police to question him about her disappearance. Frank denied knowing anything about Teresa's whereabouts and claimed that she had simply disappeared. However, investigators were suspicious of his story. A few days after Teresa went missing, authorities began to search her apartment, which she shared with Frank. They found disturbing evidence that suggested foul play. Bloodstains were found on the walls and floor, and there were signs of a violent struggle in the apartment. It became clear that Teresa had not simply run away, as Frank had suggested. The relationship between Teresa Fusco and Frank began in a way that initially seemed typical for many young couples, but it soon revealed signs of emotional manipulation and control that would shape their tragic outcome. Teresa Fusco, a vibrant 21-year-old woman, met Frank in the early 1990s. She was young, social, and full of life, enjoying her time with friends and family. Frank, several years older than her, appeared confident and mature. At first, their connection seemed like a normal beginning to a relationship. Frank was charming and appeared caring, traits that drew Teresa in. For a while, it seemed like their relationship was just like any other, marked by the early excitement of new love. In the beginning, the couple seemed happy. Teresa enjoyed spending time with Frank, and their early interactions were filled with what seemed to be the typical excitement of a new romance. Frank appeared attentive, showing interest in her life, and they would often go out together. Teresa was deeply fond of Frank, enjoying his company, and they began spending more time together. However, Frank's behaviors were starting to show signs of possessiveness. In the early days, it wasn't as noticeable, but over time it became more evident that Frank was not entirely comfortable with Teresa's independence. Teresa was sociable, and she had a close-knit group of friends and family, but Frank began expressing jealousy and would often question her about where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. While Teresa initially brushed it off, the cracks in the relationship began to show. As the relationship progressed, Frank's jealousy intensified. This possessiveness became a regular part of their interactions. Frank didn't like Teresa spending time with her friends without him, and he would often insist on knowing where she was at all times. He wanted to keep her close, but this closeness began to feel more like imprisonment than affection. Although Teresa had a strong sense of independence, she started to feel conflicted. Frank's emotional manipulation was starting to take its toll. While she confided in a few friends about her concerns, she also felt torn. She cared about Frank, and despite the growing emotional strain, there was a part of her that still wanted to make the relationship work. At the same time, she began to recognize that Frank's behavior was unhealthy. He wasn't just protective, he was controlling, and this controlling behavior gradually started to wear her down. As the relationship continued, Teresa began to feel more trapped. Frank's insistence on controlling where she went, whom she spent time with, and how she spent her days left her with less and less freedom. Teresa, although increasingly frustrated, wasn't sure how to escape or if she even could. She was unsure of how to break free from Frank's grip, especially as his behavior continued to escalate. The relationship took a dark turn as Frank's behavior became more aggressive. He began to physically intimidate Teresa, and she experienced verbal abuse in addition to the emotional manipulation. Friends and family noticed that Teresa had started to withdraw from social gatherings, and she became increasingly isolated. Despite all of this, Teresa's feelings for Frank didn't completely disappear. She still loved him, and like many victims of emotional abuse, she believed that things could improve if they just worked harder at their relationship. She continued to try and please Frank, despite the constant tension. Eventually, Teresa realized that she could no longer live in an emotionally abusive relationship. She started planning to break up with Frank. However, when she tried to distance herself, Frank became more possessive and violent. The tipping point came when Teresa finally decided to leave, a decision that ultimately led to her tragic death. The relationship between Teresa and Frank began with what seemed like the potential for love, but over time Frank's controlling and possessive nature turned it into an emotionally abusive and toxic dynamic. While Teresa was initially drawn to Frank's charm and maturity, she was soon caught in a cycle of manipulation, jealousy, and fear. In the end, the relationship that started with normal dating behaviors spiraled into violence, leading to Teresa's tragic death. Her story serves as a stark reminder of how subtle forms of control can evolve into something dangerous. What began as a seemingly typical romance ultimately became a nightmare, and Teresa's desire to please Frank and avoid conflict ultimately led to her being unable to escape the relationship before it cost her her life. The investigation into Teresa Fusco's disappearance began shortly after she was last seen on the evening of March 3, 1991. When Teresa failed to show up for work the next day and couldn't be reached by phone, her family grew concerned. Her disappearance sparked an investigation that ultimately led to the discovery of a tragic and violent crime. Teresa's family and friends were immediately worried when they could not get in touch with her. She had been working at a local fast food restaurant and had mentioned plans to stay in with her boyfriend Frank that evening. This raised alarm bells for her family, who knew about the troubled nature of her relationship with Frank. Teresa had confided in friends about the strain in their relationship, including Frank's controlling behavior, but she had not expressed any intention to leave him. Despite their concerns, her family initially hoped she had simply gone off somewhere and would return soon. However, as the hours stretched into a full day with no contact from Teresa, her family called the police. They reported her missing, telling investigators about her tumultuous relationship with Frank, which could provide important context for the investigation. The police quickly launched a missing person investigation. Since Teresa was an adult and there was no immediate indication of foul play, they initially treated the case as a possible runaway or voluntary disappearance. However, the fact that Teresa had not contacted anyone, particularly her family, raised suspicions. Her family insisted that this was out of character for her and urged the police to consider other possibilities. Given the information they had about her relationship with Frank, law enforcement decided to look into him as a potential person of interest. Frank was questioned by police shortly after Teresa's disappearance was reported. He told investigators that Teresa had left their apartment on the night of March 30 and that he had not heard from her since. He appeared calm during the interview and insisted that he had no idea where she had gone. When detectives began to search Teresa and Frank's apartment, they found unsettling evidence that suggested something more sinister had occurred. Bloodstains were discovered on the walls and floor of the apartment, indicating a violent struggle. The evidence was enough to make investigators question Frank's version of events. If Teresa had simply left or disappeared voluntarily, why was there blood in their shared apartment? The investigators began to suspect foul play, and this led to a deeper look into Frank's background and behavior. Frank had a history of controlling behavior, and his responses during questioning became increasingly suspicious. Though Frank initially denied involvement in Teresa's disappearance, the evidence from the apartment pointed to a far darker possibility. As the investigation into Frank continued, police gathered more evidence, including witness testimony and forensic findings that contradicted Frank's account. Detectives found that Frank's story had several inconsistencies, and there were signs of a violent confrontation in the apartment. At this point, Frank became the primary suspect in the case. A crucial turning point came when Frank was formally questioned again by detectives. After hours of questioning, Frank eventually broke down and confessed to the murder of Teresa. He admitted that during an argument, he had killed Teresa in a fit of rage, unable to accept that she was planning to leave him. According to his confession, Frank strangled Teresa and then hid her body in a nearby park in an attempt to cover up the crime. Following Frank's confession, authorities were able to locate Teresa's body. It was discovered buried in a park, not far from their apartment. The autopsy confirmed that Teresa had died from strangulation, and the evidence corroborated Frank's admission. The brutality of the crime shocked those who knew Teresa, and the discovery of her body brought some measure of closure to her grieving family, even though the pain of losing her in such a violent way would never go away. Frank was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence of Frank's violent tendencies and his abusive behavior toward Teresa. They argued that his jealousy and possessiveness had led him to murder Teresa in a fit of rage when she tried to break free from the relationship. Despite his confession, Frank's defense team attempted to argue that the killing was a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder, but the jury ultimately found him guilty of first-degree murder. Frank was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the case was closed, though the emotional scars on Teresa's family remained. For the first time, Teresa no longer felt a rose in her life. Teresa grieved little over Frank's murder. Frank was sentenced to life in prison rather than parental restraint. Teresa grieved little over Frank's murder, but the jury ultimately found him guilty of first-degree murder. Frank was sentenced to life in parole and the case was closed, though the emotional scars on Teresa's family remained. On the premises, Frank would live for the rest of his life with a crime. The investigation into Teresa Fusco's disappearance quickly shifted from a missing person case to a murder investigation, largely due to the blood evidence found in the apartment and Frank's suspicious behavior. His eventual confession provided the answers the family had been desperately searching for. Though it did not ease their grief, the case highlighted the danger of emotionally abusive and controlling relationships, where the victim's attempts to break free can lead to violent outcomes. It also showed the importance of following the evidence, as the initial assumptions about Teresa's disappearance were challenged by the forensic findings and inconsistencies in Frank's story. In the end, Teresa's murder was not just a tragic loss of life. It also served as a stark reminder of the deadly consequences that can arise from jealousy, manipulation, and the inability to accept rejection. The investigation into her disappearance was a crucial step in bringing justice for Teresa, but it couldn't undo the heartbreak her family and friends would carry forever. Police also discovered that Frank had been acting strangely since Teresa's disappearance. Friends of Teresa recalled that Frank had shown little emotion and had made several conflicting statements about their relationship and her disappearance. This led to Frank becoming the prime suspect. As detectives continued to investigate, they uncovered more evidence, including forensic findings that pointed to Frank's involvement in Teresa's disappearance. His behavior began more erratic, and his story began to unravel. Eventually, after hours of questioning, Frank broke down and confessed to the crime. He revealed that he had killed Teresa in a fit of rage after she had told him she was leaving him. Frank admitted that the couple had gotten into a heated argument that escalated violently. He claimed that in the heat of the moment he had grabbed Teresa and strangled her to death. In a panic, Frank then tried to cover up his crime. He disposed of her body, hiding it in a nearby park. The investigators recovered Teresa's remains shortly after Frank's confession. The trial of Frank following the murder of Teresa Fusco became a highly publicized and emotional legal proceeding. It was not only a battle in the courtroom but also a heartbreaking event for Teresa's family and friends, who had to relive the tragic details of her death in order to seek justice. Frank was charged with first-degree murder after he confessed to killing Teresa in March 1991. The prosecution presented the case that Frank had intentionally murdered Teresa in a fit of rage when he learned that she was planning to leave him. He had been possessive, controlling, and violent in the relationship, and when Teresa tried to break free, Frank became increasingly desperate. The prosecution's argument centered on the fact that the murder was premeditated and driven by Frank's inability to handle rejection. Frank's defense, however, aimed to argue that his actions were not premeditated, but a result of a moment of passion. They attempted to portray the murder as a crime of impulse, not one that had been carefully planned. The defense also suggested that Frank had been overwhelmed by emotions due to his troubled relationship with Teresa. The prosecution's case focused on proving that the murder of Teresa was intentional and driven by Frank's controlling and obsessive behavior. They used Teresa's own testimony, through friends and family who had heard her confide in them about the relationship, to paint a picture of Frank as an abusive partner. Witnesses testified about Frank's jealous tendencies, his frequent accusations of Teresa's infidelity, and his attempts to isolate her from her family and friends. The prosecution also presented the forensic evidence collected during the investigation. The bloodstains found in Frank and Teresa's apartment suggested a violent struggle had taken place. The coroner's report confirmed that Teresa had died from strangulation, a method that pointed to intentionality rather than a crime of passion. The prosecution argued that Frank had not acted out of a momentary fit of rage, but rather that he had carefully planned to silence Teresa when he realized she intended to leave him. Additionally, the fact that Frank had tried to cover up the murder by disposing of Teresa's body and lying about her disappearance was used as further evidence that his actions were deliberate and calculated. The prosecution emphasized that Frank's attempt to hide the crime showed a clear effort to avoid responsibility, and that he had not acted in a heat of the moment, but rather with premeditation. Hence, his explanations were taken literally. The defense team acknowledged that Frank had confessed to the murder, but they sought to downplay the intent behind the killing. They argued that Frank's emotional state, given the tumultuous nature of his relationship with Teresa, had caused him to snap. The defense suggested that Frank had been overwhelmed by jealousy and hurt when he found out that Teresa was planning to leave him. They painted the situation as one where Frank lost control in a fit of emotional distress, rather than an act of cold-blooded murder. The defense also attempted to frame the killing as an unplanned, spontaneous act. They argued that Frank's history of emotional instability and his troubled relationship with Teresa had created a volatile environment that led to the tragic outcome. Frank's defense attorney attempted to portray the murder as a crime of passion, hoping to secure a lesser charge, such as manslaughter, rather than first-degree murder. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury found Frank guilty of first-degree murder. The prosecution had successfully proven that the murder was not a crime of passion, but an intentional and premeditated act. The overwhelming evidence of Frank's controlling behavior, the forensic evidence from the apartment, and his attempts to cover up the crime led to a conviction for first-degree murder. The jury rejected the defense's argument that the murder was an impulsive crime of passion, and instead sided with the prosecution's portrayal of Frank as a jealous, controlling individual who, when faced with rejection, resorted to violence. At the sentencing hearing, Teresa's family members gave emotional victim impact statements, describing the devastation they had experienced from losing Teresa in such a violent manner. They spoke about the person Teresa was, full of life, loving, and with a bright future ahead of her, and how Frank had robbed them of the chance to see her live out those dreams. Frank's actions had left a permanent scar on her family and friends, and they asked for the harshest sentence possible. Frank was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the brutality of the crime, the victim's suffering, and the need to protect society from a person capable of such violence. The sentence was seen as a small measure of justice for Teresa's family, though it could never bring her back. The conviction of Frank brought some closure to Teresa's family, but the emotional toll of her loss would never fade. Her tragic death, fueled by jealousy and possessiveness, highlighted the dangers of abusive relationships. Teresa's story became a painful reminder of how controlling and manipulative behavior can escalate into violence, and it underscored the importance of recognizing the signs of emotional abuse before it leads to irreparable harm. Frank's conviction also drew attention to the issue of intimate partner violence and the devastating effects it can have on victims. It sparked conversations about the need for awareness, intervention, and support for individuals caught in abusive relationships. Teresa's family, while forever grieving her loss, found solace in knowing that Frank would never harm anyone again. The trial and conviction were steps toward justice, but nothing could replace the life of a young woman whose future was cut short by the man she had trusted. While Teresa's family lost a beloved daughter, sister, and friend, they found some measure of closure knowing that Frank was held accountable for her murder. The case serves as a chilling reminder of how jealousy and possessiveness can sometimes drive people to commit the most horrific acts. This tragic case highlights the danger of toxic, abusive relationships and the consequences when one partner seeks to control or dominate the other. Teresa's story remains a sobering example of how love can turn to violence when manipulation and anger are allowed to fester unchecked.